Open your Bibles to Judges chapter 6. We're going to look at 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8 in Judges, and we're going to follow the life of an individual named Gideon. And Gideon's going to show us how to answer the challenge of integrating faith into planning. He's going to give us 7 elements of what we're going to call a faith plan. And let's start in Judges chapter 6. And let's get a context for what's happening in Gideon's life. In verse 1, we see that Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. And so he brings into their life a chastisement. He brings the Midianites. And if you look at those first several verses, they come into the Israelis' life and they really create havoc. They have a standing army of about 135,000. They disrupt daily life. And it becomes so difficult for the Israelites that they cry out unto the Lord. And that's what God does. He brings things into our life so we ultimately turn back to Him. And then in His grace, He makes a provision. And so as they turn to the Lord, an angel is sent from the Lord, and he appears in verse 11 to an individual by the name of Gideon. Now, Gideon is a farmer. We pick him up in the threshing ground of a wine press, and when the angel appears to Gideon, he says to him in verse 12, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." You'd think the angel made a mistake. This guy's a farmer. Why is he calling him a mighty warrior? And I'm sure Gideon had the same thought. Don't you know what my job is? I'm over here and I work in the farm field. But what was happening is the angel from God was addressing him not as he was, but as he was going to become. Isn't it interesting that God has in mind for all of us something He wants us to become? Wouldn't it be great if He addressed you today with what He wanted you to become? Wouldn't that be motivational? It'd be exciting, but in this case, probably with Gideon, it's a little frightful because He's calling him a mighty warrior. And we're going to see He's going to call him to do something that he's not equipped to do. That might be true with some of us. And guess what that does to your faith life when you're called to do stuff you're not equipped to do? It's going to build that faith. Remember, we talked about integrating faith and planning. So he goes to Gideon, and in verse 14, the angel says this, "The Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?'" The first element of a faith plan is to establish a mission or a purpose statement. What is the purpose statement here? He's addressing Gideon, and he's basically saying, I want you to go and defeat Midian. That's the purpose. That's the mission. Faith planning begins with describing what it is you're trying to accomplish in a global sense. Why are you here? He's not asking him to become a king. He's not asking him to set up a political system in Israel. He's simply saying, I want you to go and defeat the Midianite army. So step 1 is to have clearly defined a mission statement, a purpose statement. Now let's make application with that in our personal lives as believers. What is our purpose? What is our mission? I went back to a reunion at Harvard Business School, a 30th reunion. Now, this is the age when you want to talk to people again, because in the early years coming out of that school, nobody has problems, everybody's successful. But you come back 30 years later, and there's some maturity and gray hair, and people have been beat up a little bit. And they were having a seminar, the opening session, and I'll never forget this. About 500 of us came into a room, and one of these leading professors at Harvard gets up, and he basically starts talking about purpose in life. And listen to what he said. He said, while we were at the business school, our whole focus was on maximizing profits, being, quote, successful. Then he says, ladies and gentlemen, have you discovered that doesn't give you purpose in life? And then he started to go on and talk about the importance of family and spiritual values. There was one guy in the back of the room, and I could see that he was frustrated as can be. He finally raised his hand, actually interrupted the professor, and he said, if that's true, why didn't you tell us 30 years ago? Isn't that interesting? The importance of having a mission statement, a purpose statement for your life. lest you climb the ladder of success and find that the ladder's leaning against the wrong wall. And so here we have all these people in a room saying, why didn't you tell us that? So let me ask you today, if you had to write a purpose or mission statement for your personal life, what would it be? What would you say? Because that, again, frames everything we do. Well, in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 7, the Lord says this, everyone who is called by my name, that's those of us that are believers in Christ, whom I have created for my glory. What's our purpose in life? To glorify God. He just lays it right out. We are here, we have been created to bring glory to our Father in heaven. I ask the question, how do we do that? Is this coming together once a week for a time of praise and worship? And is that when we're involved in ministry? Those are very important components of glorifying God. But I want to take you to the New Testament. I want to take you to a verse, and it's at the end of Jesus' life on planet Earth, in John chapter 17, verse 4. He's praying to his Father in heaven. Now, he's reflecting on his relatively short life, 33 years, and this is what he says. Father, I have glorified you on earth. He's glorified the Father. How? By accomplishing all the work you gave me to do. Now, I want you to catch this. He describes glorifying the Father with shoe leather, with the work he was given to do. Now, let me ask you something. What would you say would be the work that Jesus was asked to do from ages 0, birth, to 12? Well, he's a young lad in Palestine growing up, so his work was just to grow. What would you say would have been his work from ages 12 to 30? Well, he was a carpenter. He worked with his hands. He was a craftsman. What was his work from age 30 to 33? He traveled the countryside. He was called rabbi. He was a teacher. He was a healer. What was his work at age 33? He was taken to the cross, and he died on the cross. Now let me ask you, which of those were more spiritual? Well, obviously his death on the cross affected us, mankind, the most, but in terms of his view, what was more spiritual? They all were. And one of our great challenges for those of us in the business community that are believers is a compartmentalization of our Christian lives. See, sometimes we get trapped into thinking, I've got to go over here and work in the secular area, and then over here in the church area, I'll do my spiritual thing. Whereas in reality, we glorify God by simply accomplishing the work we've been given to do. Right shoe leather. So if you're called to run a business, if you're called into a certain kind of ministry, whatever you're called into that God's put you there, when you're doing that work, you're bringing glory to the Lord. I think of the Apostle Paul, who was actually one of us, because all the way through his ministry, what was his profession? How did he get paid? He was a tent maker. He goes into Corinth, and he's trying to figure out, and if you've ever been to Corinth, you can just see the degradation of the Roman Empire. A tough area to minister in. And the ruins there today continue to elaborate on that lifestyle. He goes up into Corinth, he sets up his business, making tents, and who does he run into? Two folks, Priscilla and Aquila, who are also tent makers. And they become the couple that he uses to launch and accelerate the ministry, not only in Corinth, but to other cities in the Roman Empire. And what he did is, he accomplished in the context of his particular work, his ministry. Now let me elaborate on that for a second. In glorifying God, we do all the work we've been called to do. There's two categories of work. First of all, there's universal work. This work has been given to all believers. What are those elements? Well, Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 says that we are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. In other words, sanctification is a work process. We're to work at that growth. We're all called to do that. Matthew 28, 19 and 20. As you go into the world, make disciples of all nations. There's a sense of evangelizing and discipling people that's been given to all of us. Then there is the great commandment, love one another. We're supposed to be loving one another. Matthew chapter 5, we're to be salt and light. These are universal works that have been given to all believers. Then we have unique work. That's what God has given you and me to focus on in terms of our daily occupation, whatever that is. So the idea is that we're to accomplish our universal work in the context of our unique work. See, that's what Paul did. He accomplished his universal work of ministry in and through the context of his unique work. Once a year, our church has a prayer breakfast, and the idea is to ask God to put on your mind and heart individuals in your unique sphere of influence that you can invite to come to an evangelistic breakfast. And so I was addressing the Lord one morning about this, and I had a table, and I was inviting 8 people to come. And I started praying about who should I invite from my unique background, sphere of influence. Remember, in the first lesson, I told you about being social chairman of my fraternity for 4 straight years. I worked real hard at that. Well, there was a fellow who was the president or commander of our fraternity at that time, and the Lord just put his name on my heart. The reason for that, too, he had been a physician for 30 years, had gotten elected as a state senator, but had decided to run for a new congressional seat in Georgia. And so I decided to invite him. I had not talked to him in 30 years. And so I called him up and I invited him to come to this breakfast. And part of my attention-getting statement was, there's a lot of votes there. So he decided he'd come. And he came in. We had a speaker from the University of Georgia, the coach there. He did a wonderful job. And at the end of the breakfast, I said, what if we get together for a little bit and let's talk about what we've heard. Now, what's interesting is I had shared Christ with him 30 years ago. And he looked at me and said, that's good for you, but I don't need it. So here, 30 years go by. I get with him for breakfast 2 or 3 times. On about the 3rd time, he says, Bruce, tell me what you mean when you say accept Christ. So I had a little booklet, 4 Spiritual Laws, and I took that out and started going through it with him. And he got to the end, and I said, would you like to pray that prayer? He said, yeah. So we bowed our heads at that breakfast shop, and he accepted the Lord. And he said, can I keep this booklet? He said, I've never heard this before. I was going to say, look, I shared that with you 30 years ago. You know, that's exactly the same booklet. But see, he wasn't ready then. He wasn't prepared. And then this individual, as he continued to trust the Lord, we decided to get together. He got elected to Congress. And he's representing the state of Georgia now. We continue to meet twice a month in a Bible study. And guess who else we pulled in? These other fraternity brothers. So now we got a fraternity brother group where we're not only fraternity brothers, but we're spiritual brothers. And what's happening is this young man, not young anymore, older man's been elected to Congress, is having a significant impact because he's a physician, he knows the Lord, and has conservative values. And on Capitol Hill, there's so many issues that deal with human services. And he's able now to start to present biblical principles and solutions. But it was all in the context of my doing universal work in the context of a unique sphere of influence. And that's your challenge, to identify your unique sphere of influence and recognize that you accomplish your universal work through that. And that then puts everything in perspective. Then your business is not something that's secular. Your business is something that's a platform of how you glorify God. Let's look at a second way to apply a mission statement. First is in our personal lives. Secondly, then, would be in our businesses. We need a mission statement as the first element of a faith plan. Several years ago, I was traveling quite a bit all over the Orient, out in Asia. And it's interesting, each time I would get off the plane and go into a downtown hotel, I was immediately reminded of my hometown in Atlanta, Georgia. And no matter where I was, I could be in India, I could be in Japan, I could be in the Philippines. What is it that you think would bring to mind my hometown, Atlanta, Georgia, even when I'm halfway around the world? And yeah, you probably have thought about it. It's Coca Cola. It's that little bottle that initially was white at the top, thin, and then white at the bottom. It's interesting to study the history of Coke, because what happened is in World War II, when the GIs were going all over the world, Coke at that time developed a mission statement. And their mission statement was to get a Coke bottle in the hands of everybody on planet Earth. And the way they did that was to make sure the GIs had the Coke bottles while they were abroad. Then when the GIs came back, guess what was left? The Coke bottle. So in 50 years since World War II, Coke has totally encircled planet Earth. There's no place you can go today without running into Coca Cola or some of those other copycat products. And we won't even mention Pepsi. But how did that happen? They had a mission statement and a purpose statement that framed what they did in their organization. It was an aggressive going after the global market, even when it wasn't that popular many years ago. So here's my challenge to you. As we go into our workshop, I'm going to ask you to work through a mission statement for your organization. And what I want you to put in it are 4 elements. First of all, identify your product and service. Secondly, identify your major market or customer. Thirdly, your distinctives. And then your anticipated results. And then what we're going to do is come up with one sentence that puts all those elements together, and that becomes then what frames your organization. It answers a question, why are you here? It's your mission. Just as the Lord said to Gideon, go and defeat Midian, you're going to have a mission statement that will frame your activities and what you end up doing. Now let me illustrate how to fill this out a little bit by sharing with you a little bit about my company. 12 years ago, I failed to make a parent meeting at our son's school, and as a result, I ended up chairing a committee. I don't know if that's happened to you, but I learned a lesson. You always want to be at the school lest you chair a committee. It was a health and safety committee. And I thought, well, this is just helping kids get across the street safely. So yeah, I can do that. So my wife and I, we were co-chairing it. We're invited to have a meeting with the administrator at our son's school. And when we sat down, he described for us what our challenge was from the school standpoint, and that was to develop a sex education program for our son's school. Now, one of the reasons this became very motivational for me and my wife was that our son was going to be in the first class. So we looked at all the material that was out there, and this is in the early 90s now, and it fell into several categories, one of which is a lot of the material was preachy, and I had an adolescent, and I knew that didn't work. And then the other kind of curriculum that was out there was pushing condoms on kids, and the parents didn't really want to do that. So I thought, well, if my son's going to be in the first class, I'll just work on a training program that will have an abstinence message. And I had a friend at that time who was the head of the CDC in Atlanta, and so he agreed to provide the medical input, and I decided to write a curriculum on one condition: total anonymity. That meant there's no way that word could get out in the school that my son's dad developed a sex ed program. Otherwise, he's dead. So I designed the material. The coach who was teaching this for the boys got up, and in his first lesson, he said, we just want to thank Brandon Cook's dad for writing this material. And so he was dead the rest of high school. But as we got into this material, what we started seeing was that kids were responding to a compelling message of why to be abstinent until marriage. We took biblical principles and we put them in a medical model, and so we started getting some results. Now that was 12 years ago. In the last 4 or 5 years, what's happened is we've been able to take that basic product, we formed a publishing company, and today we're the largest provider of abstinence curriculum in the United States. We've had over 1 million kids go through the program. We work in all 50 states in 2,500 school districts, and we just received a grant from the Health and Human Services Department in Washington. We were able to go and study the results of our program in schools. And we put 1,600 kids, half of whom were in our program, half in a control group. We evaluated the results a year later, and we found a 50% decrease in the initiation of teen sexual activity of kids in our program versus the kids that are in the regular health program. We also saw a 50% discontinuance. That means kids that were sexually active were choosing to stop. So what's happened is God has given us a mission now to take this into public schools. That's where the kids are. So let me share with you how we came up with a mission statement and how we responded as a company to these 4 questions. And that'll give you a little example of what to do when you go into your workshop. We said the first thing in your mission statement was to identify your product or service. So in our case, it was abstinence-focused curriculum. Now, the challenge here is to become either too broad or too narrow. In other words, if you get too broad, you're trying to become all things to all people. So we actually chopped off parts of abstinence education, and we said, we're not really going to do that. We don't go in and speak in the classroom. Other people can do that. Ours is a curriculum. And we're not going to focus beyond sex education. We really feel called to address that. So we're not going to address some of the other areas that different curricula address. Or the challenge is you can be too narrow. When we first started, we had one program for the middle school. And we kept getting phone calls. This always tells you when you have a need to develop a new product. People would say, well, do you have anything for younger kids because they're becoming sexually active younger? So we designed a program for them. Then they said, well, what about the high school kids? Because they need to get this message. So we designed a high school program. Then somebody called and said, well, what about parents? Parents need to get involved. So we designed a parent program. So in our mission statement, we basically designed a scope of curricula that covers all the years from middle school to high school. So as you think about your product or service, don't get too broad. That becomes all things to all people. And don't become too narrow. But try to design and identify your core product or service that you're providing. Secondly, who is your major customer? Now, back in the days when I used to do consulting, you go into a business, the tendency is you want to sell your product to everybody because every time you sell, that helps your revenue. But in each company or organization, there is a key customer. It's the old 80-20 rule. If you'll identify at the end of a given year who you actually sold your services to, you'll tend to find there's a clustering where the majority of your goods and services are sold to a certain kind of customer. And when we were analyzing our particular market, in the United States, there are 900 school districts that have greater than 10,000 kids. These are large school districts. And we said, let's go after that market because that's where the kids are. The majority of kids are in these large districts. What about the small districts? Well, we decided initially we were going after them, but when we got into it, we found we spent a lot of time and energy and effort, but our average sale was so small that we couldn't support it from a business plan. Now, maybe you've experienced that, where you go out and you try to market your products and services, and you want to go to all the people, but you get spread thin, and you find that the people that really provide the majority of your business fall in this one category. So as you go in and think about that question, make sure you're identifying your major customer. And again, continue to think about the 80-20 rule. Number 3, what are your distinctives? What sets you apart as an organization from everybody else? Because you don't want to be a me too, you're not going to be successful. And we came up with 5 distinctives as we were thinking through what distinguishes us from other organizations in this field. First of all, we're a medically based model. There's a lot of people out there that are trying to do abstinence education, but they don't use a medical model, and so we want to distinguish ourselves in that category. Secondly, we wanted to be teacher-friendly, so when we go into a school, we train and equip the existing teachers that are there. Thirdly, we wanted to be able to have a compelling message for the kids, so we use videotapes, we use exercises, we use all kind of things simply to catch their attention. And again, we find that distinguishes us from other organizations. Fourth distinctive is parental involvement. Major research indicates that the single greatest influencer of kids choosing abstinence continues to be the parent. The problem is the average parent doesn't get a lot of good body language from their teenagers at this age. If you either had them, or you're going to have them, or you're past, just think about what it was like when they hit that particular age and you try to talk about sex. The eyeballs roll back in their head, they fold their arms, and they do the, oh, I already know all of that. So you're not really encouraged. And then secondly, if they do want to talk about it, we find a lot of times parents don't know what to say. So what we did is to build into each of our curricula in the school an interview, and they have to go home and interview their parents. And it's the most amazing thing. Parents are at home, all of a sudden your teenager's coming home asking you questions that you've wanted them to ask forever. So when school districts put our program in place, they get large numbers of calls from parents, but they're all positive. Thank you. Second thing, though, is that parents need to know what to say. So we came out with a book, and it gives parents 10 conversations to have with your teen. So the idea is to have a parental involvement. Schools can't do this job alone, and churches can't. We have to get the parents involved. And then our fifth distinguishing element was research-based. We can go into a school district and we can show you what will happen in terms of decreasing teen pregnancies if you use our program. And then, what are your anticipated results? Well, when we wrote all this down, it was to reduce the number of teens that were sexually active. Do you know that teenagers that are sexually active, especially girls, are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide than virgins? Why do you think that is? It's the tremendous impact emotionally on a young teenage girl. So, you don't want your children to go down that road. Also, teen pregnancies. Do you know that by the age of 18, that 20% of all sexually active teen girls would have become pregnant? And that's the single greatest predictor of poverty in our country. So we want to try to decrease that. And do you know that by age 18, 25% of all sexually active teenagers would have contracted a sexually transmitted disease, some of which is asymptomatic, which means they don't know they got it, and some of which is viral, which means there's no cure. Now let me ask you, if your child was in this age group, would you want them to eliminate those risks? The answer is yes. And so part of our mission is that the anticipated results that we'd like to see is a decrease in the number of sexually active teens that results in a decrease in teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted disease. So now let's wrap all of these 4 together in one single statement, because again, you're trying to articulate this mission statement to your employees to make sure it provides the parameters from which you go about doing your daily business. So when we put all these together, here's what we came up with. The purpose of choosing the best publishing is to provide abstinence-focused sex education, that's our product or service, to large public school districts, that's our major customer, throughout the United States, that will result in a decrease of sexually active teens, teen pregnancy, and STDs. That's the anticipated results. So do you see what we've done? You've taken those 4 thoughts or ideas, weave them together in a mission statement, and that then becomes what you use to frame the activity in your organization.